Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 20th of July. Today we're going to be doing a frontline update talking about the situation in Klishchiivka and also about the battles going on to the north of Kupiansk. And we're also going to be discussing the third night of Russian strikes on Odessa and some of the news about the Black Sea in general. Let's begin by looking at Klishchiivka and the battles over there. And I will say that we're at a point where there's a lot of conflicting information that's coming out from both sides. And so it's very important for me to leave a gray zone on my maps because I can't say for sure whether one side controls a certain field versus another. And actually, no side really controls either of the fields that I have left open because you can't have a forward company, forward squad that is entrenched in an open field like this. It's just impossible. They would get blown into smithereens on both sides. And so there are obviously engagements within this gray zone, but no one side has a firm control over them. But if you look a bit deeper into the Russian and Ukrainian lines, you'll see some of the key strongholds that would be considered forward positions for both sides. And some of them I have marked, like this Ukrainian one, and then on the Russian side, for instance, all these forested areas. These are important Russian strong points in terms of the defense of Klishchiivka. But in terms of Ukrainian movements today, we're going to start off in the southern part of the town. The Ukrainians are making a push towards the Russian-controlled town of Andriivka. They have been able to advance at most 700 meters towards this town. And as you can see, Andriivka is important because it's on the southern flank of Klishchiivka. There are multiple roads that are leading in from the southern flank of Klishchiivka into the town and are important for resupply, reinforcements. And we do know that at the moment, the Russians are moving in a lot of reinforcements into this direction to stabilize the line because the Russians are at a disadvantage, and we're going to open up the topographic map to prove this. But the Russians are actually at a disadvantage when it comes to the topography in this battle, and so it's important that they have the reinforcements in order to hold the line on the flanks, for instance. So you can see there is two roads on the southern flank that are needed in order to supply Klishchiivka. Obviously, taking over Andriivka wouldn't totally cut off the town from the Russian forces, but it would give the Ukrainians a new avenue to attack Klishchiivka from a new direction, which is less fortified, and they'd use Andriivka basically as this staging ground to launch further attacks through this direction, wherever the arrows pointed, into the southern part of the town. And it would also give the Ukrainians an opportunity to cross the rail line and perhaps to attack some of the key highways that are leading into Bakhmut, or go south and attack Kordyumivka directly from the north if the Ukrainians were to be successful. But so far, they have not been successful due to Russian artillery strikes. In particular, the units being mentioned in terms of artillery are the 4th Motorized Brigades, so they're artillerymen. And this is an LPR unit from the 2nd Army Corps of the Russian Federation now. And so this unit was involved in a lot of the shelling that occurred before Russia took over Solidar. So they are very well known for their artillery barrages. So now they've been moved in from sort of their positions around Yakovlivka, that general area, to the southern flank of Bakhmut. So they're currently trying to hold off Ukrainian attacks where there is active fighting. Now, going a bit to the north, to the western side of Klishchiivka, this is where there's some of the most contentious battles going on at the moment. And there is a gray zone, as I explained before, because no one side can take control of these open fields without being exposed to either side's artillery fire, ATGM fires. Both sides are using these FPV drones, these very small, cheap mobile drones, which are flying at a relatively low altitude and hitting targets within a smaller radius, but they do still cause, for the local dugouts from both sides, they do cause some significant damage, and they make it harder for the Russians, for instance, to defend and for the Ukrainians to attack. We do have footage of a Ukrainian BTR-80, which was destroyed as it was attempting to enter Klishchiivka, or at the very least enter some of the forested fields, not forested fields, the forested patches to the west of Klishchiivka. And they were unable to, which does indicate that the Russians are still holding forward positions in this area. So we know where they're located, and they're trying to now push back against the Ukrainian assaults and take back some of the heights that the Ukrainians have occupied. And these heights are extremely important because Klishchiivka is located on a valley, The Ukrainians have control over most of the heights, and I'm going to open the topographic map, but the heights are generally in this area, and the Russians don't have many of those under their control. And speaking of heights, there were some pretty heavy battles for a specific height, which is called height 215.7, which I have marked over here. I'm not going to open the video. I didn't even watch the video myself, but if you want, you can watch it. In that video, what's being depicted is the aftermath of a Ukrainian assault onto the Russian heights and the Russian trench line, which is very fortified, and it does give Russia control over the northern flank of Klishchiivka, which includes forested patches and also high ground compared to the Klishchiivka Valley. So it's very important that they hold on to it. So for the past 2 days, the Russians have been defending against Ukrainian assaults towards this trench fortification system, and they were able to gain a foothold in the northwestern corner of the system for a certain period of time, but due to the artillery strikes from the 4th Brigade and also due to the air supports coming in from Ka-52 attack helicopters, the Russians were able to push back the Ukrainians from their offensive attacks in this area. So now there have been some Ukrainian casualties reported, and they've been confirmed through this video. So for now, the Russians do still hold control of this northern flank, and as long as Russia still holds it, it's going to be difficult for Ukraine to take over Klishchiivka or force the Russians out. So that's why the Russians are putting such an emphasis on it. So that's really it in terms of Klishchiivka. Going to some of the northern parts, just to the north of Bakhmut, such as Berkhivka, the fighting has really died down in recent days. Before, we had these like back and forths between the 98th Airborne Division and Ukrainian forces, especially from the 77th and some other units around here. And so now the fighting has sort of stabilized, but we're seeing more activity from the Ukrainian side towards the Russian town of Dubovo-Vasiliivka, which is just to the west of Berkhivka. So there are small Ukrainian groups that are being aided by light armored vehicles, and they have been able to make some gains in the direction of Dubovo-Vasiliivka. In terms of how much they've gained, they really haven't advanced that much yet. Maybe a bit more than 0.5 miles, but that's about it in terms of their gains. But this is done in order to take over a key town on the Russian front line that's protecting Bakhmut's northern flank. And given the fact that the Ukrainians were unsuccessful in taking over Berkhivka from the southwestern corner, if they were able to take it over through Dubovo-Vasiliivka and then attacking from a new direction into Berkhivka from the northwestern corner, for instance, that could be Ukraine's plan by attacking in that direction. But anyway, let's go to the topographic map before I move on, just so I could give you guys an idea of the entire Bakhmut situation. Just first, Klishchiivka. Here you can see the heights. Ukraine is in control of most of them. If we assume the Ukrainian line looks a bit like this, which it generally does. The gray zone, that's where a lot of the remaining heights are located, and neither side really has a strong control over them. But the Russians do want to have a strong control over them in order to sort of neuter the Ukrainian advantage that's gained by having the high ground. The Russian positions are located in this valley, which is on very low elevation. You could see it's like 300, 400 feet, and then the Ukrainian heights are like 750 feet. So there is a massive imbalance. The only area where the Russians do have control of heights are that like northern fortification area that I was talking about, height 215.7. So that's why it was so highly contested. And then going to Berkhivka, in terms of the elevation around there, Berkhivka is on a valley, but so are all of the Ukrainian positions which were used to launch attacks towards the Russian positions. And so there's not much an advantage for either side in that regard. And then the same thing really goes for Dubovo-Vasiliivka, which is a town a bit to the west. The Ukrainians do have control of some ridges that are overlooking Orikovo-Vasiliivka from the north, but not from the south. But we have seen repeated Ukrainian attempts at attacking from Orikovo-Vasiliivka into Dubovo-Vasiliivka over the past month and a half. And they are trying to push into these two ridges that I have marked in red in order to give them positions to overlook the Russian positions within the valley. That's it for Bakhmut. Let's go on to the situation within Kupiansk. So, in the Kupiansk sector, I have made some changes, and this is because even though I was pretty confident in the fact that Russia had control over the entire forested area and that their positions were really on the outskirts of Sinkivka, not just from the north, but also from the western side, I have not been able to really see any other sources that corroborate this at the moment. A month ago, when I first reported on this, there were a lot of sources that were reporting on these Russian offensive activities. But now I'm seeing, and this is from both sides, by the way, like the deep sea map, you could open the Rybar map, you could open up any map from either side, and you'll see that the front line looks more like this in the sense that the Russian forward positions are a bit to the west of Liman Pershi. So the implication is that the Russians advanced from their forward positions in Masyutivka and took over all of this forested area, which was previously contested from the Ukrainians, and that they've now consolidated control over the flanks around Liman Pershi. But just remember, the Russians were always in control of Liman Pershi, so they did not acquire a new town just yet. But if these reports are true of Russian advances through this forested area, then they're making their way into the direction of really the last part of this forested area adjacent to the Oskil River. And if they're able to clear all of this out, which they are trying to do, their goal is to attack Sinkivka. We've already seen reports of attacks on Sinkivka directly from the north, but we have not seen many coming in from the northwest. But if Russia does take over the forested area, which seems like they want to do, then they will be able to attack from that direction as well. And the Ukrainian forces in Sinikivka, they are pretty far away from the main Ukrainian garrison, which is on the eastern side of the Uska River within Kupiansk with the armory and some of the suburbs. Like a lot of Ukrainian forces are in Petropavlivka and not many in Sinkivka. Sinkivka is like a forward position, and there aren't many other towns that Ukraine has in the area to sort of connect to it. And so the Ukrainians in Sinkivka, their role is to hold out for as long as possible to give the Ukrainians in Kupiansk, in the Kupiansk suburbs, as long as they need to beef up defenses before the Russians eventually succeed in overrunning the town and then try to reach Kupiansk itself. And so the unit doing that, you have 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade, but you also have reinforcements from the 14th Separate Mechanized Brigade. Now, that's really it for the front line. There wasn't that much change, but once there are more changes to the map, I will add in a new feature where you can see the percent of land that Russia or Ukraine gained in a certain region, a certain oblast, because that seems like a pretty interesting metric to get an idea of the gains. But just remember that once I do that, there will be very small numbers because neither side is making any significant gains in comparison to the size of a whole oblast. But anyway, let's talk about the situation in Odessa. So, tonight was the third night that the Russians hit Odessa. As you recall, the first time that they hit Odessa in this most recent round of strikes by the Russians was 3 nights ago after the Crimean Bridge explosion, but they have not stopped yet, the Russians. So we started off with reports that there were two 22 N3 strategic bombers, and there were four of them that were airborne above the Rostov region, which is in Western Russia, around here. And then the number became eight Tu-22s. So they were airborne above the Black Sea at that point, and they were carrying these Kh-22 anti-ship missiles and also Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. So the Russian strike started at around 6:30 Eastern time. I'm just going by Eastern time because that's what I know. But you could add 7 hours to Eastern time and you get an idea of the situation or for the time zones in Ukraine. So the Russian strike started at around 6:30 and they began with Russian Geron 2s being sent to the Sumy Oblast. That's where explosions were reported. Then by 7 p.m., there was a first wave on Odessa in terms of airstrikes and Geron 2s being sent in, and mainly around the port area. In terms of the reports, there were reports that The ports being hit included the one within Odessa itself, and also the port a bit to the south, which is on this in this town Chornomorsk. I think the name of this port is the Ilichevsk port. And there was another wave at 8 p.m. This time using these supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles. These Onyx, sorry, that's what they're called, and also KH-22s. So these were airstrikes, and there were also explosions reported in Mykolaiv. Mykolaiv, as you recall, was hit on the first night, but not on the second night. So it's now being hit again, and there is a significant port in Mykolaiv. Obviously, not as much shipping traffic for Mykolaiv because it's closer to the front line, but still is an important area with a lot of oil tankers. So that's why it's presumably being hit. Then, by around 8:30, we heard of new Duran 2 drones being launched at Odessa and also at Sumy and Kherson. So tonight was a very busy night, and we don't know the extent of the damage from tonight just yet. That's going to come out tomorrow morning. But what we do know is the extent of the damage from yesterday, at least to a certain extent. And what we know is that, at least according to NASA firms, there were some pretty significant fires within a train station. And I'm actually going to go to NASA firms and show you guys this. So here's the fire map. Obviously, it's not foolproof. Sometimes there are mistakes with this map, and sometimes it doesn't show the full extent of the fires. But you can see generally there's a huge fire cluster just to the west of the airport in Odessa. And this is an area where you have a rail station. It's located over here. And you also have a myriad of different industrial facilities. You have oil tankers. And it's not the only area that was hit according to the fire map. You also have near this reservoir area, you have fires. But surprisingly, you don't really see many fires within the port area. The huge concentration is within this area over here with the train station in the western side of Odessa. This is an area that, I don't know, perhaps they weren't able to put out the fires yet. I'm not exactly sure what would be the reason why we didn't see as much in the port, especially because both sides, regardless of their affiliation, acknowledge that there were heavy strikes on Odessa, and there was also footage on the ground showing damaged cranes, damaged oil tankers, and the Ukrainians, they also said that there was destruction of 60,000 tons of grain that was being stored near the ports, which was supposed to be shipped in their vessels, obviously, to the rest of the world. So why is Odessa so important? Well, as we said before, they have all these grain and oil terminals. They have storage tanks. They have a lot of loading equipment. They have these warehouses filled with not just weapons, but also there's barracks that are being set up in this area. Obviously, there's not as much men in these barracks as there was previously. About a year ago or half a year ago, a lot of the men that were stored in these Odessa barracks that were conscripted, they've been moved elsewhere for the counteroffensives. But regardless, there is still a military significance and economic significance. And by damaging these ports, this is a calculation by the Russians in order to damage Ukraine's economy, as we discussed in the last video. Because again, the Ukrainians are trying to improve their domestic industry, and one of the best ways to do that is by exporting their grain, which a lot of the world relies on them for this grain. It's really a breadbasket, so is Russia. And given the war, a lot of their other domestic industries have been damaged. Also, the Ukrainians had significant political leverage due to the fact that they had this ability to ship all this grain, and that could be utilized in the context of sort of getting third world countries on Ukraine's side, because a lot of the reason that Ukraine was saying that the grain deal was necessary was in order to feed the third world. Now, they also obviously shipped a lot of the grain to the EU, so this is also a bargaining chip with the Europeans to continue support with them. And so if the Russians are targeting these ports, and not just targeting the ports with these airstrikes, but also canceling the grain dealer, not renewing it, by doing that, there's a significant implication that the Russians are making that they're going to try to blockade the Black Sea, which would not allow the Ukrainians to send vessels, obviously. So I'm going to read the Russian statements in relation to the Black Sea and just get a look at it for yourself. So what the Russians are saying is that all of these ships, these Ukrainian ships or international ships that are sailing to Ukrainian ports will be considered potential carriers of military cargo, so Russia may hit them. They reserve the right to do that, and any ship that is coming in the direction of these ports, these Ukrainian ports, will be considered on Ukraine's side. Any country which is sending this, whether it be ships or any sort of equipment on that ship, they will be considered as a military belligerent on Ukraine's side. So that is a pretty extreme thing to say for the Russians in terms of what the implication would be is that if, for instance, there was some sort of international ship from a different country that came in through the Black Sea trying to make it to one of these ports, then the Russians would consider it as potentially harboring weapons that could be sent to Ukraine, and that they would be trying to aid Ukraine in their war effort, and that Russia would treat them as such. That's, in essence, the implication from this. And so there is the threat that now the Russians will go out of their way to send the Black Sea fleet closer to Ukraine's coast to prevent any sort of shipment back and forth into and out of Ukraine. And in terms of what the West is saying about this, at least the United States, they were saying that they are not really looking at measures in order to support more of Ukraine's shipment or movement of ships. But all in all, there's not much of the Americans could have done about this. The Americans, because the theory would have been that the Americans would have sent in their navy to help support and escort these Ukrainian ships. But again, in order for America to send warships into the Black Sea, they need some agreement with Turkey, and there's already some strict international law about this. There's a treaty signed in 1936 about this specific sort of situation where countries that don't have a border with the Black Sea, they're very handicapped in terms of the sort of naval personnel, naval facilities that they can move into the Black Sea. But given the fact that Turkey really holds the keys to the Black Sea, then it would really be up to them to see what could be moved in. So now all eyes are on Turkey to see how they respond to Russia's recent words that have been released by their MOD. We're going to have to see how Turkey really plays its cards from their position of power in this regard. So that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in my next video. Goodbye.